What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Mass Effect Andromeda. This is a title that, truth be told, I was mostly just curious about personally after having reviewed and played the actual Mass Effect trilogy for the first time this year. And having primarily heard negative things about Andromeda, I just had to know for myself how this game actually was. So I bought it, played it, and we're talking about it in this review after 100% now. That said, to give my usual spiel, I review games after 100% all the time, primarily to set me apart from other YouTubers and content creators. And while it does include the achievements, it also includes more than the achievements. And if you're not subscribed to the channel and you go to my channel page, first video you'll see is a video explaining everything that I cover. Now, as I mentioned, Andromeda is a game that I had heard almost primarily negative things about. The only real positive thing anybody really ever said was that the gameplay was pretty solid. Now, I'd also heard a few things about the development of this title, and this is, for starters, the game itself kind of sidesteps the continuation of the Mass Effect trilogy. Obviously, the trilogy leaves off on a pretty significant place storyline-wise, and Mass Effect Andromeda just does not answer that question at all and takes the story to another galaxy, Andromeda. Furthermore, this game was developed in a separate engine from the Mass Effect trilogy. It was their Frostbite engine, I believe, that it was brought into, whereas the previous games were Unreal Engine. Now, this might not sound very significant, but it means that they had to create all new assets for this new game. And that's important when we start asking ourselves about why some of the races are missing and why we don't see some of the alien species that we saw previously. As if I had to hazard a guess, also judging by the DLC bait that they kind of threw in at the end of the game, is that largely this was more of a financial decision and they only wanted to make the assets for the more popular stuff and then add the more superfluous races, etc. in the DLC, which then of course never happened after Andromeda basically flopped, at least in terms of its reception. Another thing I want to mention before we start diving into specifics here is that most of the issues that were prevalent at the launch of the game have largely been ironed out. While the game never really got DLC or post-launch support outside of bug fixes, etc., it did get those fixes. So a lot of the things that you saw from the launch, like the crazy facial animations going all over the place, and then a lot of the prevalent technical bugs, have pretty much been done away with. Playing through the game now in a technical sense was very smooth. I only encountered one or two bugs and they were very minor, usually related to the UI. But with all of that said, let's actually jump into the game a little bit here. So I want to start with character creation since that's where we start the game at. And honestly, just the character creator was kind of a letdown. It seems so hard to make a character that looks any different from just the presets. And I actually just got kind of annoyed with it after messing around with a while and just decided to go with the default appearance just so I didn't have to mess with this character creator anymore. And that's unfortunate because character creation is primarily cosmetic. You do pick a sort of starting class in character creation, but it's just that, a starting point. The character building in Andromeda is very free form. There's no real classes, but rather profiles, but we'll get into that here in just a minute. But at character creation, all you do is kind of pick a starting class, which will give you your starting abilities, but this is by no means a binding choice and gets kind of made irrelevant very quickly. Now, from here, let's talk the story setup. Now, for starters, I want to mention that this game, in terms of its RPG elements, as in choice and consequence, is very, very minor. For starters, there are less than 5 major choices, I would say, throughout the game, almost none of which have consequences. The ones that do have consequences are so minor, they do not matter. Like literally a person you don't know or even talk to really lives if you make a certain decision. Like that's the type of consequence we're talking about, and it just does not matter. So in that way, when we're talking about the story setup for this game, understand that your writer and that story just kind of is what it is. You will make some choices, but as far as consequences go, they're just not really there. In theory, this is something we would have seen again either in DLC or a sequel, but again, with the critical reception of this game being what it was, we're just never going to see those consequences, and as such, the choices are simply irrelevant outside of personal taste. Now, in terms of the actual story, we, of course, are traveling to the Andromeda galaxy, and we kick off the game by being woken up from cryostasis, which is how we made the journey through dark space to the Andromeda galaxy. Unsurprisingly, this does not go well. We very quickly run into a phenomenon known as the Scourge, which was not on the scans that were made before the trip began, because those scans were made 600 years ago. Andromeda takes place 600 years after the Mass Effect trilogy, and this is largely because they had had to travel through dark space in cryostasis to make the trip. So things like the Scourge and other problems weren't foreseen, but are now being encountered. The Scourge has made the planets that you were planning on inhabiting uninhabitable, which, as you might imagine, is a bit of a problem. Very early on, the game starts showing a lot of problems with the writing. I'm not going to go full story spoilers here, as honestly, I could probably talk for an hour or two if I covered the entire plot, and we're just not going to do that. So to sum it up a bit quickly, very early on, your father, who you are shown as having a bit of a frosty relationship with, dies. You become the new Pathfinder. The Pathfinder is a role that was essentially meant to explore and work on making planets habitable and expanding your influence in the new galaxy. Your father was the Pathfinder. He dies, passes the implant for the AI known as Sam to you, which is effectively what marks you as the Pathfinder. This makes it your job to travel around the galaxy and work on making it habitable. This is done through technology you encounter early on in the game, known as remnant tech, which is essentially a lot of terraforming technology left by some prior civilization. While the planets are no longer workable or inhabitable from the previous scans, the technology left by the remnant will make them habitable. However, in doing this, we run across two races involved in a conflict, the Ket and the Angara. The Ket are a species of alien that are kind of just generic bad guys, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second, and the Angara are the friendly race. They're a little untrustworthy when you first meet them, of course, but these are the only two new races we really see in this game. Now, in coming up against the Ket and the Angara, we get involved in the Ket's search for remnant technology. They want to use it to effectively weaponize it and force the other species in the galaxy to submit to exaltation, as they call it. So this part is kind of a major story spoiler, whereas everything else has been a little general. This part is a pretty major plot point, so if you don't want to hear this, maybe skip ahead past the story section. But it is important to this overview, so I'm going to talk about it. But exaltation is effectively where the Ket turn other species into new Ket, with various properties from the original species carrying over. It's never explained why the Ket want to do this, but purely that they want to do it. It's why they're in the Andromeda galaxy. They actually come from somewhere else. They've primarily been doing it to the Angara, but one of the reasons you're given, or at least it's alluded to, as to why there are no other species in the galaxy is because supposedly the Ket apparently exalted them already, and it's really only the Angara left. I would tell you that as a plot point, that's effectively just a narrative reasoning on why they could not support other races being in the game, which largely comes down to actual practical development problems, I imagine. But nonetheless, it's the reason we're given. Or again, it's alluded to. But effectively, what the Ket are trying to do is use the terraforming remnant tech to make the worlds uninhabitable even further, to the point where they can't sustain life, to where the other species either submit to exaltation or they die. However, just that kind of undermines the entire point. If you're here in this galaxy to perform exaltation on the species, why would wiping them all out as an alternative be better? And this is what I was alluding to when it comes to the poor writing. There's a lot of plot holes that just don't make a ton of sense, and that's prevalent throughout the story. Now, I would tell you, broad strokes, the story is okay. It's kind of forgettable, but it's not the worst I've ever seen, and most of the plot holes could be filled in with more writing. They just never are presented to you in a way that is explained thoroughly, which is a bit disappointing, especially when they throw in one-liners about why there are no other species. But at the same time, they don't ever explain why the Ket are doing this. And the Ket's motivations at times just seem at odds with each other. Now, again, broad overview, the worst of the story is the beginning, which is a terrible place to have bad story because people see it, they get put off, they don't play through the rest of it. However, around probably 10 or so hours, the game does kind of pick up a bit, but the beginning of the story and the beginning of the game are not good. It's very slow. They're explaining basics that the plot setup would have told you anyway. The game takes like 5 hours to explain that you're new to Andromeda, things aren't going well, and it's like, I get it, move on. But it's a very slow start to the game, and some of the worst writing in the game is in the beginning. And this is, of course, where we get our infamous "my face is tired" memes, that type of stuff, which combined with the facial animation bugs was just a mess at launch. But now it's kind of eased up a little bit, and we're just left with effectively bad writing. Now, to give just a couple more opinions before we move on to gameplay and world building, again, the story is actually broad strokes okay. I imagine DLC or potentially even like a spin-off sequel, etc., were probably designed to fill in some of the plot holes here, and we just never saw them. That is my benefit of the doubt assumption. But nonetheless, these plot holes are here now. They don't make any sense. And I haven't even talked about the exiles yet. So before you and these ships called the Arks carrying all the species and people to the galaxy got here, about a year earlier, the Nexus arrived. This was essentially a multi-species crew designed at setting up a sort of central hub for all of the colonies you were trying to set up. When the Arks didn't show up on time because of the Scourge, things went downhill and there was a rebellion on the Nexus and exiles kind of got kicked out of the Nexus. However, throughout the game, we find the exiles thriving and doing perfectly fine on worlds that we were told are uninhabitable, which is like, I don't know how these are uninhabitable. The exiles seem to be doing just fine without you. If anything, they're actually better off than the place they got exiled from, so it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But in spite of all of those plot holes, the story, broad strokes, it's okay. It's very forgettable, unlike the other Mass Effect stories, which were very memorable. But honestly, a lot of the characters are forgettable. The setup itself isn't that interesting. The Ket never get explained. They're just a generic bad guy. The Angara are interesting, but the story doesn't really focus on them or their culture that much. A lot of that's handled through side quests. And with all of that said, let's finally move on to gameplay and world building. First and foremost, when it comes to gameplay and world building, is that the quest structure of this game is god-awful. It's almost like someone was trying to make it as bad as possible. A lot of the quests and side quests, the loyalty missions for your companions, all of that stuff can actually be pretty interesting. However, getting through those quests due to how they were made and set up is just not fun a lot of the times. And this comes down to loading screens and backtracking. So a lot of the quests will have you just running around what feels like in circles, but really you're just kind of going back and forth between areas to have like a 2-second conversation and then leave again. And it sucks. Because if you are on a planet or in a location, in order to go to another planet, you're looking at 3 loading screens. And a lot of quests will have you go talk to somebody on one planet, and that's it. And then you leave the planet to go to another planet that person sends you to. So effectively, every time a quest does this, which is often, the game has presented you with 6 more loading screens just to get to the interesting part of this quest. So every time this happens, you are sent to go talk to someone. You have to get in your ship, leave the planet, which is a loading screen, travel to that area on the galaxy map, which is another loading screen, and then land on the next planet, which is another loading screen. You go talk to that person, the conversation is over in like 30 seconds, you get back on the Tempest and do it again. The Tempest is your ship, by the way. And I'm really driving this home because I have never seen such poor quest structure in a game. I've played games with bad quests. I've played games with quests that are tedious. I've played MMOs, which a lot of people like to compare this and Dragon Age Inquisition to. But MMOs have better quest structure than this. This is awful, and it's hands down the worst part of the game, which is why I'm talking about it so much. However, on the flip side of that, the rest of the gameplay largely takes place in 5 open areas. It's sort of like open world little places you get sent to. And these are the places that you, as the Pathfinder, are meant to make inhabitable. Now, you'll of course be here for main story reasons, and the planets themselves kind of open up as you progress the story. But typically speaking, when you get sent to these areas, they have a hazard of some sort that makes parts of them actively kill you just by being there. And the primary story with the terraforming technology and a lot of the side quest exploration opens up avenues of making these areas inhabitable. And you can actually do this by activating some of the remnant terraforming technology on each planet by exploring remnant vaults, which are actually pretty cool. You can effectively remove the hazards from each of these areas for the most part. Some of them never fully go away, but you can mitigate them to the point where it's not a big deal anymore. However, this doesn't make a lot of sense when you're trying to make a planet viable for habitation when exiles have been living here for apparently like a year. But nonetheless, the gameplay of exploring these worlds is actually pretty fun. So for starters, you get to drive the Nomad. From the first planet, you actually get access to this sort of monster truck version of the Mako from Mass Effect 1. And it's actually a lot of fun to drive. It's got 2 modes, like an all-wheel drive so you can go uphill with it, and then a regular mode that moves a lot faster on flat ground. You can buy a bunch of upgrades through research and development, which is crafting more or less. You can upgrade this Nomad vehicle that way, which makes it even more fun to drive. So the exploration in the Nomad was actually a lot of fun because the world is, again, sort of open world. So you're kind of free to drive the Nomad around and just have fun, which is really helped along by the fact that the areas that you actually go to are gorgeous, visually very cool. 2 of the planets are basically a desert, which I thought was kind of a strange choice. A lot of these areas they tried to mix up a little bit. And then the very last one you go to is a desert again after the very first planet you went through was a desert. So it just kind of felt like an odd choice to do it that way. But beyond that, the exploration of this game and like running around the map, I did enjoy a lot. Now, before we move on though, as I mentioned, you're going to be exploring remnant ruins and activating them via your AI. So this is usually done through using your scanner. You're introduced to the scanner very early on. You scan objects. It gives you information and research points which are used in crafting, which we'll get to. When you go to a new remnant site, you usually have to scan for glyphs. Once you scan these glyphs, you can interact with the console at the remnant site, and it will either activate immediately, or you'll have to solve a Sudoku puzzle, which is the weirdest introduction of a puzzle I think I've ever seen in a video game, because these are just Sudoku puzzles. I actually used to do Sudoku puzzles a ton when I was in high school and you were like bored during homeroom type of stuff. I would just have a book of these that I would solve because I'm a nerd, and I just did not expect to find this here, and it was just a very weird experience. But yeah, you can solve a bunch of these Sudoku puzzles to help out with the remnant exploration. Now, other important things to know about the gameplay and the world building. Obviously, it's filled with a bunch of Mass Effect universe stuff, but it's kind of mostly irrelevant. Like, yeah, you got all the trappings of Mass Effect, but that's about it because you're in a different galaxy, so a lot of that stuff just doesn't matter. The Asari, the Krogan, and all that's here. The Krogan actually used their time in cryostasis in the 600 years that went by to perform some gene therapy on themselves before they got to Andromeda. That helped alleviate the genophage, but not completely cure it, was my understanding. But it causes a lot less stillbirths, or unviable eggs, I guess. So the fact that this is the Mass Effect universe, outside of a few mentions to what's going on back in the Milky Way via side quests, etc., it's just not really brought up a lot, and in that way it just doesn't feel connected to the universe of Mass Effect much at all, honestly, outside of, again, just the trappings of it, basically. Now, some other important things to note about the gameplay and world building are the crafting, as I alluded to. So you have a scanner, you can scan all sorts of stuff. This is used in questing a lot, but you can also scan various things for research points. These come in Milky Way, Helios, and Remnant. These will allow you to research various sorts of crafting schematics. As you level up, more crafting tiers are available to you to research. Once you've researched them, you can then craft them. The research part of this is fine. The crafting part of it sucks, because the crafting requires you to have so many resources that it's not really viable to craft a lot of stuff until you get too close to the end of the game, when it doesn't really matter anyway. Now, this is primarily because the resource costs are outrageous. If they wanted to make crafting useful, you would have to cut the resource requirements by like 75%. Outside of just dedicated resource gathering, which would have taken me hours, I just never had enough, even with straight up buying the resources, to craft much of anything useful when I was a low level. Again, it's possible to kind of mine while you're exploring, and you can gather resources this way, but it takes a lot of time to get enough resources this way. You can also buy the resources, but early in the game, you can't buy the resources that you are probably going to need to craft anything. So while I like the premise of the crafting system, the research and then actually crafting it, the execution is terrible. Like, just bring down these resource costs so I can use the system you made. Another thing are the viability points. So as you make more and more of the worlds inhabitable, you will earn viability points, which lets you bring more people out of cryo, as obviously without worlds to send them to, they can't bring everyone out of cryo. But as you make more worlds habitable, they can, and this will give you various perks, which is a nice touch, I guess, but, you know, kind of whatever. It's just a system to give you nice gameplay perks and add a layer of progression. You never actually see these people or interact with them in any way. It's purely set dressing, if you will, so it's there, I guess. And then last but not least, before we move on, the UI of this game is really bad. You kind of get used to it after a while, but there are just way too many menus, and they are way too clunky to use. So you have your journal, which is pretty standard, but this is divided up into folders, so you have to click into various folders to find your missions. You can't track multiple missions at once, which is kind of annoying given their folder system. system, but not the biggest deal in the world. Then there is your separate inventory menu. Then there is your separate codex menu. Then there is your separate inventory menu, which is set up terribly. There is your separate skills menu, and that's pretty much the stuff you're going to be accessing from your just regular old menus when you bring up your inventory. Then there are separate menus you have to access from various other places, such as the crafting menu, the viability menu. I haven't even talked about the strike teams menu yet, which is primarily a multiplayer thing, but you can send teams out on missions, which will net you some rewards passively, kind of in the background. These missions take time to complete. You can also play them out through a multiplayer mode, which is available but not really relevant to this review at all, as this doesn't really cover the multiplayer aspect of the game, but that part of the game is actually working, so you can still play multiplayer if you want. But that is yet even more menus. All of that to explain to you, the UI is terrible. Now, from here, let's actually move on a little bit. So we're going to talk character progression and then combat. So as I mentioned, the choice of starting class at the beginning, character creation, is not really important. As you start leveling up, you start earning skill points. You can put these into any of the 3 trees, which have a ton of abilities and passives for you to choose from. These are combat, biotics, and tech powers. These are basically the skills we've seen from the previous 3 games, and you can put your skills in any one of these. It really doesn't matter. The other part of character progression are the profiles. These are effectively the classes from the previous game, but what they do is act as a passive buff to whatever type of class you'd like to be. For instance, if you go with the biotic build, then you would have passives that boost your biotic damage, etc. So soldier, vanguard, all the usual stuff from the previous games. As you put points into your skills, you'll actually rank up these profiles and unlock them actually according to how many points you're putting into combat, biotics, or tech accordingly. It will then unlock the class or hybrid class, and then as you put more points into it, these profiles will level up and give you bigger boosts, which help you with the play style that you want. You can actually switch the profiles out on the fly in the middle of combat, but this does reset the cooldowns on your powers and stuff, which is a little bit annoying, but a cool option at least. And in that way, the class you make is very freeform. Now, I actually like this for the most part. If anything, I don't think they took it far enough, which I'll talk about in just a second. Because while you have access to all of these abilities, you can only equip 3 of the abilities at any time. Now, the passives obviously are up all the time, but the actual triggered abilities that you put on, you can only use 3 of them at once, which is a bit boring. Now, that said, you can just keep leveling until you have enough points to max out everything, though I would tell you around level 50 or so, I was very comfortable. You can respec at any time, so basically all you got to do is go back to the Tempest, hit the respec button in the med bay, and you're good to go. You can just rearrange everything how you want. Nothing stopping you from playing around and messing with build styles here. However, I wish they would have given you 2 more abilities. I think 5 would have been a better spot to be in, but that's a preference. So let's actually talk about the combat. Truth be told, combat is pretty good. I enjoyed the combat of this game. Most of it involves what you'd imagine for a cover shooter. You're in cover, you shoot at things, but you get all these abilities that you can mix and match from the 3 trees that I mentioned. Moreover, some abilities are primers and some abilities are detonators, meaning that you can hit an enemy with a primer ability and then hit it with a detonator ability to cause a combo to go off, which will then cause a bunch more damage. You can mix and match these to do biotic combos, tech combos, elemental combos. Overall, very fun. Combine this with the fact that Andromeda is the first game, in my opinion, to have a cover system that isn't awful to engage with, primarily because all you have to do is just walk up and your character gets into cover, and it's much more natural and fluid than it was in, say, Mass Effect 1, which also tried to do that, but kind of threw you into a separate animation that locked you into cover, whereas Mass Effect Andromeda lets you kind of move around more freely and take cover, which just feels a lot better. I think it's honestly what Mass Effect 1 was trying to do, but it actually works. Combine that with the usual assortment of guns from the previous games, and honestly, these guns are essentially the same, actually. There's a few new ones, but a lot of them are honestly what you'd expect. You can just get your favorite guns from the Mass Effect trilogy and use them in Andromeda. They're here. There's also some new stuff from the alien races if you want to mess around with those, but there's a lot of variety to the weapons, and the combo system, again, pretty cool. Really, though, the combat itself was probably balanced around the multiplayer. That's more than likely why you only get 3 abilities here, and I think that's to the game game's detriment. I really wish I could have just had a couple more abilities to give myself a bigger variety of combos, and I think that would have made the game just insanely more fun for a system that was actually already pretty fun in a game that otherwise had a lot of problems. And I think, again, a lot of these limits just come down to that they balance the game around multiplayer, which is a bit disappointing. But again, the combat of this game, actually fun, which is a bit surprising given, how negative I've been up to this point. The combat is fantastic. I enjoyed it a lot. I just wish there was a little more variety to the enemies and the actual abilities you could use. Now, last thing I want to mention on the combat front is that Insanity mode is simultaneously the best mode for regular fights, but the worst mode for boss fights. So I played through the game on Insanity, of course. While Insanity is, in my opinion, perfect for the regular fights, it makes boss fights awful. So a lot of the boss fights will just have you essentially fighting an enemy that is kind of immune to damage in some way until you target a specific piece of it, but that piece now has a crap ton of health. So some boss fights on Insanity just take 10, 15 minutes of just shooting at a guy and just emptying clips. He's not dangerous to you if you built right, so it's just not a challenge, and you're just unloading clips into a bullet sponge, and it makes the boss fights not fun at all. And the problem here is that if I lowered the difficulty, it kind of made the inverse a problem, where the regular fights were a joke and the boss fights were just finally okay. So kind of an interesting mix there. Now, one thing I do want to mention on the combat front, though, before we move on, that is honestly a little negative. Some fights just have enemies spawning in randomly, and if you're unlucky, sometimes they'll just spawn in directly behind you and kill you, especially if you're on higher difficulties, which got pretty annoying pretty quick, so you kind of have to learn spawn points in set encounters, and sometimes, again, you just get unlucky out in the sort of open world part on where the enemies spawn in when you're fighting multiple waves, and while it's not the worst thing in the world, it definitely could have used some tweaking. Now, moving on to the companions before we start to wrap this thing up. So, the companions are, of course, a very important part of this game. Unfortunately, like a lot of other characters in the game, several of them failed to be any kind of interesting. We get 6, ultimately. We start out with Cora and Liam, who are part of the Pathfinder team that we were going to be working with originally. Cora was actually the next in line to be the Pathfinder, but your dad passed it on to you in a direct violation of protocol. She's actually pretty cool with that, and she actually used to kind of work and perform in a combat unit with Asari before she joined the Andromeda initiative. So she is a biotic and can use sort of vanguard abilities. Overall, she's okay. This is a game where human companions really struggle to be interesting to me because you have this world of crazy alien species, and you're effectively just making me talk to some random guy or girl. It just makes human companions a tough sell. So Cora is kind of low on the list because of that, but she did have a really cool loyalty mission, so that's something. Liam is the Caden of this game to me. So if you watched my Mass Effect trilogy reviews, wasn't a fan of Caden. Liam is Caden 2.0. He fails to do anything redeeming. He honestly just annoyed me, and he didn't have enough personality to make up for that. Again, though, really cool loyalty mission. Structurally speaking, you wind up on a ship that gets messed with in terms of gravity, so you wind up walking on ceilings and the sides of hallways and stuff. Very cool layout for that loyalty mission. But character himself, very boring. Then we have Vetra. I liked Vetra a lot. Vetra is a female Turian, and she kind of subverts what you would expect from Turians. Turians from the trilogy are a very military, meritocracy kind of hierarchy thing. A lot of them are pretty by the books, but Vetra is actually a sort of smuggler, drifter type of person. A lot of back alley dealings, that type of stuff, black market type things. And I found that pretty interesting. She's not the most interesting character that she could possibly be, but compared to what Turians normally are, I thought she was interesting enough. Her loyalty mission revolves around her trying to take care of her sister, who she basically raised, which was a good enough story, but overall, she's okay. Then we have Drac. Drac is a character who I think makes a pretty bland first impression, but is probably the best companion overall. Now, I like Krogan, honestly, but Drac, when you first meet him, kind of feels like they're just trying to give you a Krogan companion and they just hand you one. However, he's a very old Krogan, 1,000 years old apparently. And he's coming up towards the end of his life, and he knows it. And he actually raised another Krogan, a female Krogan, that you can meet on the Nexus. And they actually have a a really good story that leads to a kind of funny scene with a bar fight. And I don't know, Drac managed to win me over more so than most of the other companions. He's actually pretty cool, even if he doesn't make the best first impression. Then we have PB. PB is very annoying. So companions and people's opinions about them are inherently very subjective. Personally, when it comes to companions, I can get past a companion that I don't like if they have a personality that they stick to, if that makes sense. If they can be sort of an interesting character in that they shake the game up a little bit, or they just adhere to being a certain type of way, and it's interesting. PB manages to be interesting, but my God, is she annoying. But I kind of like her that they stuck with that personality. I kind of said the same thing about Sarah in Dragon Age Inquisition. I can see why people would not like her at all, and honestly, I don't kind of like her, but I appreciate that they gave her a personality. PB is obsessed with remnant tech, and she does a lot of incredibly stupid things to study it and causes you a lot of problems. She also has a ton of commitment issues, which is unsurprising. Now, she's our Asari companion, as I'm sure you saw on screen already. And a lot of her loyalty quest revolves around dealing with the sort of ex-lover and remnant tech, as you might imagine. But while I don't like PB per se, I appreciate that in a game full of uninteresting characters, she managed to make me feel something, even if that feeling was incredibly annoyed. And then last but not least, we have Jal. Jal is our Angaran companion, or the alien race. Jal manages to be really interesting just because you don't know a lot about the Angara, and he's kind of your gateway to learning about them. Through Jal, you learn kind of all about the Angara, of course, their feelings about family and emotion. They're a very emotional, if you want to call it that, and close-knit species. And seeing Jal interact with you, a species he also doesn't know anything about, is some of the best of what this game has to offer, honestly. And a lot of his loyalty mission revolves around the Rokar, or the subsection of Angara that don't like you and believe aliens should not be here in their galaxy, meaning that they hate the Ket, they hate you, they hate everyone who isn't Angaran. But his loyalty mission revolves around actually becoming his friend and then dealing with the Rokar. Overall, I thought Jal was kind of up there with Drac. I would say Jal, Drac, and Vetra were the best, and then the other three were okay at best and very forgettable. Outside of, maybe PB, because again, she's kind of annoying. So the companions, real mixed bag. Some of them just failed to make an impression, but that kind of is the case with a lot of NPCs. I know I don't talk about NPCs a ton, but just so many of the characters in this game are just so utterly forgettable. But nonetheless, that brings us to our conclusion, which, as you might imagine, is a bit of a mixed bag. So we're going to talk positives, negatives, and then actually formally give a conclusion. On the positive side of things, because this game is not all bad, despite this being admittedly more of a negative review than my typical stuff, the combat and the exploration are actually pretty good. I enjoyed driving the Nomad around and seeing these planets and checking things out. They felt very alien and untamed in a lot of ways, even if there is kind of a lot of people around. But nonetheless, I enjoyed exploring. It was fun. The combat was, again, fun. It kind of lacked a few things here and there. There are things that if they had done DLC or potentially went farther with this story, I would have liked to see. But considering all the changes they'd already made to get to this point, I liked the combat. It was fun. But then we have the negatives. Quest structure, by far and away the biggest one. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. It's bad. So many quests send you to a planet to talk to one person just to turn around and send you to another planet, which effectively, again, puts at least 6 loading screens in your way. And that's just a bad decision. Then we get to the UI. Again, very clunky, way too many menus, none of it's very visually clear. Very surprising to see a AAA game with just this bad of a UI. That's unusual. Then, as I mentioned, the early game is not great. It's too slow. They keep telling you the same stuff over and over again. It takes a while for the story to go anywhere. When the story does go somewhere, they tell you the what's happening, but not why it's happening. But more than anything, the early game is just off-putting. You have to slog through like 5 or 6 hours before you can get to the better part of the game. Which is why I imagine if you look at the Steam achievements for Mass Effect Andromeda, which are by no means a perfect metric, but they do tell us something. By the time you get to establishing an outpost, which is kind of like the end of the prologue, if you will, the Steam achievement is already down to 52%. By the time you actually get to the completing the game achievement, you're down to 20%. But again, you've lost half of your players before you even get out of the prologue, which isn't terribly unusual. Most people don't actually finish games. That's a well-known thing. But again, with Andromeda, you've lost literally like 50% of the people who started playing before you get to the end of the prologue. That's crazy. And then last but not least, on the negative side of things, is the lack of interesting characters. Few characters manage to stand out, which is a real bummer. The ones that do are pretty much either companions or one of the new races, or the antagonist. But the antagonist also isn't really interesting or a good character. He's just memorable because you see a lot of him. And he looks a bit different than everybody else. So in conclusion, I would say my curiosity for why people talk about this game the way they do is satisfied. I would simultaneously tell you, though, it's not as bad as everyone makes it out to be. Right now, you can pick this thing up for like $30, which is not a bad price for what you're getting. If you want to do everything, you're probably looking at like 80 to 100 hours, depending on how you play. And if you just want to do the story, maybe 40 to 50. For $30, there is a lot to explore here. Unfortunately, it just feels like the game gets in its own way a lot of the time, which is a real shame because this game is not without its high points, which again, exploration and combat, that stuff is a lot of fun. The exploration and exploring these planets in this way is kind of what I would have loved to see in Mass Effect 1 when you could drop down in the Mako. So in that way, it was nice to see that gameplay mechanic, if you will, fully realized. But to wrap this thing up, and again, as I mentioned, I satisfied my own curiosity. Mass Effect Andromeda is simultaneously not as bad as everyone says it is, but also not great. It's a good game at best, but it's very mediocre if you look at the whole picture. And strangely enough, a lot like Pathfinder Kingmaker, this is a game that I wanted to enjoy. There are parts of it where I was honestly having a good time, and then the game just kind of gets in its own way. But these days, several years after its release with its reduced price point, yeah, it's not as bad as people make it out to be. But it's also not great, like a lot of the Mass Effect games were, and I think that's what really set people off. Because if I had bought this at launch and paid $60 just to run into all those technical problems and bugs that were memed to hell and back, yeah, I probably would have been pretty angry too. But now, several years later, having only played like $30 for it, it was okay. I've played worse games, I've played better, which is disappointing when you attach the Mass Effect name to something so average compared to how the trilogy was. But that's pretty much all I've got for you guys. A bit longer than my normal reviews, but a lot to mention here, and if I had gone into the story, this probably would have been like 2 hours long. That's pretty much all I've got for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below how you feel about Mass Effect Andromeda, potentially what you think it could have been or other directions you wish they might go, or what you might be wanting from Mass Effect 4, maybe things you liked from Andromeda that you'd like to see in the next game, which they are actively working on at the time of this video. But nonetheless, thank you for watching again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.